Welcome. I'm Angela Seifer. I'm the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, and this is our 6th in our series of Net Inclusion webinars. Net Inclusion is usually an in-person conference. We are online this year, so we split them up one per week so that nobody would have to do this for hours on end. So we're super excited to have you with us. We're going to give folks just another couple minutes to get into the webinar, and then we're going to get started. Welcome. This is our 6th in our series of Net Inclusion webinars. We're thrilled to have you with us. We're just waiting for folks to get into the room. Welcome. I'm Angela Seifer. I'm the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. We are thrilled to have you with us today. This is our 6th in our series of Net Inclusion webinars. We usually have our conference in person, and we will in 2022, assuming everything continues on the path it is on now. We will be in Portland in 2022. We're all very excited about that. NDIA is a community, right? So it's hard for us to not be together. This is the closest we can get. So know that we are here to support your digital inclusion efforts. We have a lot of other resources on our website. We have twice monthly community calls. We have an active listserv. Today it's really blowing up, so apologies to everyone who can't get other work done. But it's a big day, and I'm really thrilled to be hosting this panel today because it's so incredibly timely. If you happen to miss it, the federal government Treasury yesterday released their guidance on how some of the stimulus money could be used, and digital literacy and internet access were specifically mentioned, which is a big deal. The fact that those were in there and the fact that we're doing this panel today is all right? It means the work you all doing is finally going to get some resources. And this panel is about those resources and how it is that they can best be used. We added this panel. We originally did not have this panel in the lineup, but we added it because finally folks are paying attention to digital inclusion. Finally, there's resources, but we're seeing a lot of resources going towards just the access to the internet and the devices, but not in that human side of it, not that help that folks need. And so today we're going to talk about why do people say no to free internet? So we're really thrilled to be having this panel. Our own Deputy Director, Gina Cooper, is going to moderate this panel. So I'm going to turn it over to Gina now. Gina, it's all yours.
Thank you, Angela. Welcome, everyone. My name is Gina, and I'm the Deputy Director of NDIA, and I'm very excited to have you join us for this timely conversation. I'm calling this conversation timely for a different reason that Angela explained. Today's a big day. I've been at NDIA for 3 months, and for all 3 of those months, in just about every conversation for the last 90 days, I've heard the letters EBB. After all of the chatter, the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program starts today, and this conversation should provide some insights for those of you who will be enrolling participants. Let me set the stage for you a bit. Prior to NDIA, I worked for an organization that provided services to homeless population. When you work at such an agency, you're accustomed to getting many kinds of free donations, all of which we appreciated. On occasion, someone might drop off a food donation that we didn't expect. If we didn't know where the food came from, or if we didn't know that it was from a trusted source, we would say no. Why would we say no to free food when people need it? For many of the same reasons that people say no to free internet who need it. Just because people need things doesn't mean that they'll settle for anything. Today, we'll be talking about why people say no to free internet and what to do about it. I'm here like most of you because NDIA doesn't have all the answers. I've asked. So we've enlisted a panelist of experts to help us talk this through and figure it out. A lot of people think the answers are infrastructure, deployment, and affordability. In some cases, those are the answers, but it turns out that it's a little more nuanced, a little more complex than that. Here's how today is gonna go. I'm going to ask some questions of our panelists, and while that's happening, you'll get to submit your own questions in the Q&A box, which I'll get to in a bit. Let's get started. I'm beyond excited to have these panelists join us today. They come to us with an abundance of experience, they tell great stories, and they're pretty funny, so hopefully you'll learn some and laugh some too. No pressure. Today we have Hannah Hill, project leader at Boston Consulting Group, Heather Savaris, principal consultant at the Columbus Foundation, Dan Noyes, co-CEO at Tech Goes Home, Lloyd Levine, Senior Policy Fellow at UC Riverside School of Public Policy, and Brett Perkins, Senior Vice President, External and Government Affairs at Comcast. To start, I'd like to invite each of you to introduce yourselves. In addition to your name and organization, please briefly tell us about your relationship to digital equity or inclusion. Brett, you go first.
Mute here. Well, thanks for that succinct and great setup, Gina, and thanks to you and Angela for including me in this conversation. So my name is Brett Perkins, and I'm the Senior Vice President for External and Government Affairs at Comcast. I lead our local government affairs as well as our external affairs team. I'm based in Philadelphia at our headquarters, and we support our work around the country. I was one of the people that helped to write our Internet Essentials, the proposal that became Internet Essentials, and then helped to launch it about 10 years ago. And I work with our Internet Essentials team and our community impact teams that work with many of the partners that are represented here and other policy organizations on digital divide. It's a personal and a work thing for me. Thanks.
Lloyd.
Yes, good morning, and thank you. I agree with you. This is a very important seminar. My name is Lloyd Levine. I am, as you said, Senior Policy Fellow at the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. Prior to that, I served as a member of California State Legislature, where I chaired our Committee on Utilities and Commerce. That committee had jurisdiction over, in addition to electricity, broadband, telecommunications type technologies. I've actually been working on digital divide issues since about 2003. My first big piece of legislation in the legislature was to cite high-speed communications equipment, and I've kept going since then. Founding board member of the California Emerging Technology Fund. And at Riverside, I work on technology and digital divide and broadband issues, publishing a number of papers relating to broadband adoption, digital inclusion, broadband as an intersectional technology and enabling technology. And we'll talk more about that as we go on, but that's pretty much who I am.
Thank you. Dan, you're up.
My name is Dan Noyes. I'm the co-CEO of Tech Goes Home. First, thank you so much to Gina and Angela at NDIA. As much as I love these virtual ones, I'm really excited for Portland next year. Anyone who's watching this webinar, do sign up. If you don't know, Brett at Comcast has offered to buy everyone dinner that goes to the Portland NDIA meeting. So I'm with Tech Goes Home. We're a digital equity nonprofit based in Massachusetts. And basically, we provide computers, internet access, and digital life skills training to those that don't have it. So kids can do homework, adults can find jobs, seniors can connect to loved ones, everyone can access telemedicine, and everything that most of us take for granted. So that's us. It is personal for me too. In my life, I worked in Boston schools for a good long time and saw every day the struggles that the kids had, where at school they had what they needed and so few of them had what they needed at home. So it's part of why I do what I do. So thank you.
Heather?
Hello. Thank you guys so much for having me as well. My name is Heather Savares. I am a principal consultant at the Columbus Foundation, which is a large community foundation. And I lead our work there in community well-being. And part of my work is facilitating projects in partnership with actual community members, so that we can not only better understand what are the issues that our community members are facing, but what are the solutions that we might co-create together to really get at those problems. And so in the digital equity space, I've had the privilege of working on a series of projects around the digital divide. Some of those have been with Columbus City School kids and the district. And then more recently, I've had the opportunity to work with some of our residents who are experiencing poverty and to understand kind of how this shows up in their lives. So excited to be here and have this conversation with you all.
Thank you, Heather. And last but not least, Hannah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Hill. I'm a project leader at Boston Consulting Group. I do a mix of consumer work and education work and social impact work. And I've spent close to the last year fully dedicated to focusing on the digital divide. I worked closely with Common Sense on the reports that BCG put out with them on the digital divide in education. And more recently, I've gotten to work with Brett and the Comcast team on some of the research we'll be able to talk about today about the sponsored service programs and why people don't take free internet. It's a topic I'm very passionate about, both from the equity lens and also from the economic development, and really seeing digital not as an end in itself, but as a means to really that next generation of our society and our economy. So really exciting for this conversation today.
Okay, thank you all for those introductions. I'm going to start with the round robin. So you'll each get a chance to answer this question, but it's going to go quick. Recently, I was reading a story. In Connecticut, the state asked schools to identify barriers to getting families online. The Education Technology Commission released a 40-page report in February. Although all students who needed a laptop for remote learning received one, thousands of students never logged on to remote classes. When they asked families why, what reasons did the family give? I want each of you to share 2 reasons. Be quick, don't repeat.
Okay.
Hannah, you start.
All right. Nobody jumped in. Go ahead, Hannah. I don't care.
I would say, and I know we'll get into the research, I would actually say it's much more emotional. I would say the 2 reasons people don't sign on are uncertainty and trust. Uncertainty around what is the program, do they qualify, how to use it, and trust around, am I going to get charged, am I going to break it, can I trust what I'm being told?
Okay, this is quick, so just 2 quick answers. Heather, you go.
Kids need a new why for doing school in some cases, and language barriers and how that shows up.
Dan?
Affordability and language. Oh, you just said language. ID requirement.
Lloyd?
I'm going to go with, as answer number 1, lack of digital literacy skills and or technophobia. And then as answer number 2, lack of home support, whether it's from the parent or somebody else to facilitate that online learning.
Brett?
All right, I got it at the end. So I'm going to say home circumstances. So housing insecurity, multiple residences, and then and the last one up here. So I had digital navigation, which I guess is a combination of what Lloyd said and Hannah said.
Those are all great answers. I'm just going to read the list. I think you covered them all, but they were families didn't want to share their personal information. There were language barriers. Someone pointed that out. There was fear that they'd be on the hook for hidden costs or commitments. Carriers sometimes improperly delayed access for families, past due balances, housing instability. Brett, you got that one. And others struggled with limited capacity of a single table connection. So thank you all for participating in that quick round robin. Next up, Heather, I have a question for you. You told me that you want to take radical approaches to solving some of the biggest problems, and that centering lived experience is integral to your work. You walked me through one of the Columbus Foundation's co-design processes for internet adoption. For this particular process on internet adoption, you worked with food soldier, I believe that's the name. Why did you choose this particular process for this topic of internet adoption, and what did you learn?
Thank you. So I'll say this, for about a year now, I've had the privilege of sitting in some community, some of our newly established broadband coalition meetings in Columbus. And in these meetings, we sit with some of the most powerful folks in Columbus to try and valiantly solve the digital divide. And it's striking to me every time that we're in these meetings and these conversations, who's not there and what we're not hearing. And, oftentimes we hear that it's about devices, it's about hotspots, it's about digital literacy, it's about access to close the gap. But when I think about the folks in our community who are currently experiencing poverty, they're not in the rooms. They're not part of the conversation. And so it makes me wonder, are people experiencing poverty? What do they have to say about the digital divide, right? How are they experiencing it? Do they think there is one? Are they really not on the internet? If given devices, would they be on the internet more? So all these questions, right, that we constantly think about, but centering on the lived experts, right? People who are currently experiencing poverty, where are they at? So before we started the project that we did, my team had an inkling, right, that there were folks experiencing poverty in Columbus who were solving their problems, social issues, problems online. And the reason is a group called the Food Soldier in Columbus. And that group is a Facebook group of about 15,000 people. And what they do is every day of the week, you can find out where people are doing food, free food distribution. And importantly, you can also, if you go to the food bank and get things that your family doesn't need or want, you can do a porch pickup where you tell your neighbors, hey, come to my porch and you can take advantage of this. So it was this really interesting way that neighbors were helping neighbors, solving problems at scale using technology. So it made us want to do a little bit more. So we spent some time with residents to actually understand what were they experiencing, right? So we paid a handful of residents to help guide us through this process. We conducted approximately 20 hours worth of interviews, paid interviews with other residents to really go deep, to not only understand how are they seeing this, but what do they think the possible solutions are? And as often happens with this process, we spent time refining our understanding of the actual problem that was a bit askew. So what did we learn? It's true that residents experiencing poverty in our neighborhood or in our community, they don't have laptops, right? But most of them didn't necessarily need them or say they valued them, right? It's also true that many of our residents experienced shoddy internet quality, especially if they were receiving cheap or subsidized things. But the residents believed that if they paid full price, they would only then get consistent or fast service. It's also true that many residents were not doing formal tasks online. They weren't comfortable doing formal tasks online, but it wasn't because they didn't know, they weren't digitally illiterate, right? But they didn't feel comfortable because so many of them, in fact, all of them that we had talked to had experienced some kind of theft online. And as one young mom told us, when you have so little, and somebody takes from you, it matters. And therefore, I'm not getting my birth certificate online. I'm not doing those things because that's the part where I'm at risk. So, for us, I think a problem like this, it's so vitally important to walk with, and understand directly from folks who are living it.
Thank you, Heather. I love that you uplifted centering lived experience. Dan, I know that Tech Goes Home collects a lot of data, including data on the households who don't sign up for free internet. With this in mind, tell us a story through an experience you had signing people up for free or low cost offers.
Yeah, just in a quick preamble to like who we serve. So 90% of the people we serve are considered very low income by HUD. More than half are considered extremely low income, so people living in poverty. About 85% of the people we serve are BIPOC. About half are the adults we serve are immigrants. And sadly, because of the pandemic, about 35% of the adults we serve are currently unemployed. So it gives you a sense of who we're serving. Our data on this is really interesting, Gina, and I think, Hannah, I'm very excited for the report that you guys over there put out, and I think it's confirming what we're seeing, is that, so with Tech Goes Home, we offer free internet to anyone for a year that takes a Tech Goes Home course. And we offer two options. We offer Internet Essentials via Comcast, thank you, Brett, and then we offer Hotspot. But what we're finding is that the vast majority of people choose the hotspot. And about 75% want the hotspots, and only about 25% want IE. And what we're also finding when you dig in the data further is that of the people that get Internet Essentials, only about 20% follow through with the code that they get, which would give them 1 year of free internet. On the hotspot side, the absolute vast majority of people use the hotspots. And I know that because we see the data, where right now, this is an interesting note, for anyone who says that data caps are okay, the median user of a Tech Goes Home hotspot uses 300 gigabytes a month. So when we see these caps at like 100 gigs a year, let's throw those out. And then lastly, I'll just say the costs. I mean, I get the bills. So we're sending about $100,000 a year to Sprint while we're spending less than $10,000 to Comcast. And I think everyone mentioned awesome reasons why. I think 3 more that I would say that our learners are telling us: confusion about process and about the obligations, confusion about what speeds are and caps are and all of that. And the last one I'll mention, and we're hearing this especially from the immigrant population we serve, is fear of the government. We have a lot of people we serve that are fearful that ICE will come and take them away if they sign up for any sort of national program. So I hope that answered your question, Gina.
Thank you, Dan. It does. And that is the fear of the government is something I've heard before for immigrant and migrant populations. Lloyd, when I arrived at NDIA, the first thing that I read in depth was your paper on broadband adoption in urban and suburban California. NDIA staff think that your research is so important that many of us have read, reread, printed, keep it handy for reference. This paper, this is your opportunity as an academic to tell practitioners what they should know from your research.
Well, first of all, thank you. That's honestly why I do these things, not for any self-fulfilling thing, but I write and research to make a difference, make an impact, because I know that, while some reject fact-based policy, there are people who really look for these sorts of things. So what would I tell policymakers? I think you need to really focus on 3 things. This is my top line, because I know I only have a short period of time here. It's a concept that I created about 3 years ago in a paper, and it's called meaningful internet access. Because we talk about access, but we don't really understand what that means. And I also want to stop before I go any further and say the digital divide is really two divides. It has the same impact, same effect, but there's 2 causes to it. In rural areas, it's really lack of access to infrastructure. In urban areas and suburban areas, it's income driven. The infrastructure is deployed. Most areas in the country have 2 or 3 providers to choose from. It's just a matter of, and this is backed up by research, the cost of service, computing device, et cetera, is not affordable. I saw a comment earlier that talked about lack of understanding. That used to actually be a reason. People didn't understand the benefits of the internet, but in all of the research I'm seeing from Pew and from California specific research, low-income people without internet access will cite what they're missing. If I had it, I would use it for X, Y, and Z, and they're very specific things. So they know what they're missing. So the internet, as I said, going back, is really two things. It's a rural divide and an urban divide that combine with 2 different causes, and they have 2 different policy solutions. But in driving for those policy solutions, it's policymakers should aim for what I call meaningful internet access. And it's a 3-part test. It's broadband connection equal to the government speed, minimum speed served. And if you've got 2 different versions, like a state speed served and a federal speed served, it should be whatever the fastest is. That's what you need to drive towards. Second, it's a computing device, and I don't specifically name a device, but it's a computing device able to do the kind of majority of tasks of the time. It is not a cell phone. If Brett were to try and type a resume and cover letter on a computer and I were limited to this, he would be done far faster than I would, and his resume and cover letter would be much better looking. If Brett and I were to apply for the same job and Brett were to use a laptop or a computer and I were to use this, he would apply for that job much more successfully. So it's a device. It could be an iPad, a Surface Pad with a keyboard, but it needs to be able to have the full functionality of the people you're competing against. And then the third component of that is the digital literacy skills to use it. Too often I'm seeing governments just focus on the broadband connection, which is important. I'm not denying the importance of that, but a broadband connection without a device and the ability to use it really, leaves people, hamstrung. It's like building roads and freeways without providing them cars or buses and means to get around. And so that's what my lesson to policymakers. We can talk about the policies, but and I could go on forever about that, literally. But at the top level, you need to focus on the goal. And the goal should be meaningful internet access. And the last part of that goal that I don't include in that is sustainability. And the problem, particularly at low income levels, and somebody mentioned this earlier, unpaid bills. If you have an unpaid bill, some of the carriers won't allow you back into their program. Or, so a lot of people say, oh, I'm on this program, but then something else comes up. And so one month they don't pay the bill, so they lose access, they're up and down. Sustainability needs to be a key as well. You need to have that access throughout the year. And I'll conclude with, I saw a school district negotiated back in September a 6-month deal for their students. And I thought, well, wait a minute, doesn't the school year last 9 months? Isn't there summer learning? And they were very proud of that 6-month thing. And okay, fine, I get it. But at the same time, seemed a little bit short-sighted. So sustainability of meaningful internet access is what policymakers should drive for.
Thank you, Lloyd. Your meaningful internet access model reminds me kind of the 3 legs of the stool that NDIA often references. And the sustainability piece is important too. Hannah, earlier I said that this is complex. You've conducted research addressing low take rates of sponsored broadband service. You also know that the issue of adoption is about more than deployment infrastructure and affordability. There are many barriers. First, tell us what a sponsored agreement is, please. And then second, what did you find from your research?
Sure. So the sponsored service programs really came up during the pandemic. It's a way to accelerate internet adoption for eligible low-income, specifically households with students. They're typically sponsored as an agreement between an ISP and a sponsoring organization, hence the name, but either a municipality or a district, a philanthropic organization, some combination of those that pays for the internet, so it's being offered at no cost to the household. And while these are amazing models for accelerating adoption, they've also given us this really unique test case to look at, okay, if we can take this area where we know internet's available, it's being offered for free, and households need it because they have students learning remotely, why are people still not taking it? And so we, in partnership with Comcast, sought out to answer this question. And I'd say the preview is our findings are much in line, Heather and Dan, with what you were just saying. So we interviewed more than 2,500 households across the US to ask them about this. We also had interviews with, I think, more than 60 households, school districts, community-based organizations to get more of a qualitative perspective there. And ultimately came down to call it 4 major categories of why people don't have access. Either a lack of awareness, a lack of clarity around the offerings and processes, lack of trust in the services, or other structural barriers, as Brett was talking about in the beginning. So just a bit more color on each of those. The lack of awareness, people said they didn't even know the program existed, or they conflated it with what was already out there in some of the other existing low cost or subsidy programs. And so because they didn't see it as distinct, they didn't feel a motivation to sign up. The second one around lack of clarity around the offerings or processes, there's a few layers to that. One, I think more than 30% of the people in our study found that they weren't sure if they qualified. They either thought their income was too high, or they were disqualified because they had internet. And this is something you see across sectors. I think, Gina, to your point around the food bank, some people say they don't use the food banks because they think it's for people needier than them. Other people just did not understand how to navigate the application or installation processes. And you're dealing with households. It's a bit, you're not having the student sign up, but having the parent or the grandparent, and they're looking at internet and they're saying, I'm starting from square one, I've never had internet before. I don't know these words. I don't know what a router is, what a hotspot is, what a modem is. The third bucket around trust of services, again, I think that there's a few layers there. Gina, and I think Heather as well, what you were talking about of, you see an offer and it's free and you think it's too good to be true. And consumers say it's free, it must be cheap, it must be low quality. This is documented across consumer research. And I think to Heather, the point you also made, they're afraid of cost. They say, okay, I'm low income, I am struggling with basic needs around rent, around food, even though it's marketed as no cost, if there's any risk that I might incur a cost, it feels like too big of a risk and I don't want to do it. And then to the other point around, there's concern around providing information and fear of the government. Providing any information, especially social security number, even when optional, can be really scary, either because of immigration status or fear of debt collectors or fear of government, even if it's not going to be ICE having your information. And then the last one was really around structural barriers, which I think comes back to what Brett was saying around they live in challenging housing, be it a basement dwelling or an attic, and you look at it and it's hard to connect if there's already a connection in the unit.
Thank you, Hannah. I posted the link to the BCG and Comcast report in the chat for people to review. Brett, thank you for joining us today. One thing that stands out in the research and a common theme in the topic of adoption is trust. Through Internet Essentials, what has Comcast learned about the necessity of trust?
Great. Thanks for the question, Gina, and great hearing Hannah do a quick run through of the lessons from the research. So we've been administering and running Internet Essentials for the last decade, and having cumulatively signed up 10 million people, lots of lessons learned. And some of these lessons learned, I go back to the very beginning, thinking about the research that was out there 10 years ago, and the pandemic hits, and you go, this problem that we've been talking about and dealing with and inching closer and closer to now becomes not optional. But a lot of those lessons were things that we just didn't dig deep enough to fully understand. So 10 years ago, we had to argue about, is this just about deployment or is it adoption a piece of it? The NDIA then couldn't have existed because people didn't want to hear that message. And now we have a community of practitioners that focuses on this piece of it. And so as we go through and look at the adoption issue, the lessons that we learned 10 years ago now are just becoming into sharper relief. And so we knew 10 years ago at the very beginning that partners were going to be everything to our success. So if you look at how we implement Internet Essentials, it is a community-based offering. It really is about partnering in the local communities. I learned an early lesson and learned some humility in the very beginning through partners of ours who just said, you don't understand this community, but I do. And if you want to be successful here, then it's better for you to work through us. And so if you look at what we do, we work through a network of thousands of organizations. Part of that is that's how we're organized. But we've shifted our community impact to reinforce that. So working with organizations and particularly focusing on digital literacy and broadband adoption work. So this issue of trust is one that really we heard it in the beginning, and we knew that to get people to even listen to the offer, we had to have organizations that were trusted in the community. But when you start to tease out things that were mentioned in the research that Hannah just spoke about, you realize that it is an absolute necessity if you're going to really cross over and address some of these barriers. So the structural piece of this, we know this, and for the practitioners who are here, you know this every single day. You're dealing with families and children who are home insecure. Either a child who is moving between homes or folks who are experiencing homelessness. And so the idea of how do I connect them, where do I reach them, and how can I get them to listen to me is a big deal. Language, we talked about language. And again, having someone who speaks your language, who understands your language in the context of your culture as well, and being culturally relevant is really important. We know, and I live here in Philadelphia, for our undocumented citizens, people who have a real fear, a well-founded fear sometimes of providing information, getting somebody who can speak to them and help them cross that transom is all about trust. So we've learned a lot in that. I think the last thing that I would say, and I think the practitioners here would all agree, is that we're still figuring out what are all the little ways, the little nudges you have to do to make sure everybody gets over the line. Some of these things are easy, right? We can just make it a free and someone signs up. But there's a whole bunch of other reasons that we can't ignore. And for that, it takes people who are actually living and working with people day to day in the communities where they live.
Do we have time for a quick interjection?
Quick. Yes.
So, Brett is so right. And my research shows that as well. Trusted messengers are the key. People don't trust the government. They also don't trust the big utilities. So that's vital. And then, the other thing he said was it's different now than it was 10 years ago. And that's a key to solving the problem as well. Solutions that worked early on have already connected those. When you see who's left unconnected, it's the last of the last. And it's not a small chunk, it's the last of the last. New strategies need to be employed to do that. And I just wanted to say that Brett said those things and they're so important. I thought they should be really emphasized.
Okay, thank you, Lloyd. I wanted to go back to one thing that Brett said. It was great that you lifted up communities as assets. Thank you for sharing that. Dan, Tech Goes Home has been doing this work for 20 years. You have a lot of experience signing people up for free solutions. Can you tell us some recommendations you make to ISPs based on your data and take rates?
Are you saying I'm old, Gina? Is that what you're getting at? Yeah, we have been doing this for a while, and serious shout out to Brett too. And I give Comcast a lot of flack sometimes, but they were the first to come to the table with us 10 years ago when the conversation was IE. Now it was a very different program then, and but I will say Comcast has listened. I think there's more to do, and that's why we're here to keep talking about this. So to your question, Gina, I think I don't know if Lloyd or Brett mentioned this, but having a multilingual, multicultural view of this is so important. And that comes down to just specifics of making sure you have multilingual phone lines that are properly staffed, so you don't have someone trying to call and get on and sit there for 4 hours. And also with the campaign, like thinking about where you're looking, where your ads, what do they say? I think another big thing we're hearing from our learners is you need to have extreme clarity. And I use that word intentionally, extreme clarity on terms and costs. If it costs $10 a month on your ad, it better cost $10 a month when the bill comes. If the modem costs $15 a month and you say your service is $20 a month, but it's actually $35 a month, you are doing a disservice to the people you're serving. You just can't do that. Another thing, extreme clarity on speeds. Deb Sosha, who many of you know recently, I don't know, last week or something, talked about, why do we talk about what the ceiling is for floors, for speed? Maybe we should talk about the floor is for speed. So people know if I'm signing up for a service that says it's going to be 50 megs a month, well, I know it should be at least something, as opposed to maybe up to 50 and then you get 10. I mean, that doesn't do anyone any good. Another quick note on that too, if I could, please make it so whatever offer you're offering poor people is at least equal to the lowest offer you make commercially, because otherwise that is incredibly disrespectful. If I go online and say I can't buy that speed, so please do that. Data caps we talked about. Let's get rid of data caps. I mean, that, as I mentioned earlier, materials that are put out are simple. And the last thing I'll mention, just as one of these, like you said, the service provider, I totally agree with what Brett is saying and what Lloyd just said. You need the community to help do this. Well, how about you help provide funding to the community organizations? They're trying to sign people up for internet access. I think that's a big, big thing with this too. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dan. Heather, you shared a lot about how you honor the voices of community members. You synthesized what you heard by asking how might we questions. We have over 200 digital inclusion practitioners and advocates on this call right now. So I'm going to ask you, what advice would you give us all as we struggle with the complexity of getting people to say yes to free internet?
Thank you for the question. And I feel like all of these inputs are making me question what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think in order to get people to say yes, right? I think Hannah has alluded to this, others have alluded to this, right? We really have to understand what problem is free internet solving for these folks. And I think that, for people experiencing poverty, does free internet make their life easier, right? And really thinking about the value proposition and the relevancy. And I think, oftentimes I use this analogy with my colleagues. I say, hey, this is like we're having a dance, right? And I tell somebody, you get to come to the dance. I have a dress for you and I have some steps. It's going to be lovely. Come and play, right? And folks are like, yeah, like that sounds great, but that's not really on my terms. Thank you very much. And so I think this idea of how might we reimagine, like what is on folks' terms. Like, what does that look like? And I will tell you, when we started this most recent project, we started with how might we close the digital divide in Columbus? And as we thought about it, and as we really went deep with people, right, and in those the qualitative empathy work, we refined that to move to how might we ensure people experiencing poverty can use technology in all the ways they want to and need to, right? But really thinking about that value proposition and that relevancy. And I know that's, in our case in Columbus, we'll have the free internet and 30 families show up, right? As opposed to all the ones that we need. And so really going deep on that mistrust, going deep on all of those times where people didn't meet their word, right? But I think for us, it's thinking about how close can we get to residents? How can we solve with residents? There's an amazing woman in the community in Columbus, and she has said, she's like, Heather, in all of my years, I have never seen someone solve a problem successfully for someone. I have only seen people solve problems successfully with someone. And so I think that would be my challenge. How do we partner hand in hand to really get at these pieces, to really get at value proposition and relevancy, and to make this frictionless so that, folks show up in the way they need to and want to show up.
Thank you, Heather. Similarly, Hannah, I'm going to ask you to speak to the over 200 practitioner and advocates on this call. Share with us what you think is essential to driving adoption and how we can get to yeses from more households.
Yeah, and I think it echoes and dovetails really nicely with what Heather just said. And as we thought about what are the solutions and how to address some of the barriers that came up in our research, we really took that consumer lens of how can you make it seamless and frictionless for consumers so that they have that experience of saying, I want it, I know how to get it, I can get it, and if I have questions, I know where to turn to for support, and really taking that consumer lens. And so we focus our solutions around four key initiatives. One around strong communications, clear, strong communications. How can you explain the message clearly, not using technical jargon or terms, making it very clear about the terms in a way that is clear but not overwhelming? And how can you share those messages through trusted channels, community organizations, educators, faith-based organizations, civic groups, so that you're hearing, and we see these similar practices in place today with a lot of the vaccine efforts. But how can you look at this and send trusted messages through trusted sources so that people feel comfortable with what the product is and how to apply? Two, around how can you adapt the program design to best fit the needs of these individuals in these households? One is streamlining the application. How can you take out the number of steps or pieces of information that it takes to apply? We see this trying to navigate the EVB website today, that there still are many steps involved. And I think with the sponsored service programs, the ideal is really having a data sharing between an ISP and a district so that the household doesn't have to provide any information, but there are many steps between where we are today and that can still be beneficial for a family. And on the installation side, how can you really make it so that anyone can do it? Like, I think about the fact that when I install broadband in my house, I still want technical assistance sometimes. And so how can you give this IKEA style instructions and have the resources right there so that it's easy to apply? Third is around making sure that support is there. And again, I think that comes back to the community organizations. In our research, more than 40% of respondents said that they wanted someone to walk them through the process step by step. It was the most requested support that would make the program easier. And so being able to enable these organizations so that they can offer that support and assistance is key. And then fourth is really, and I think Lloyd and Dan and Brett all talked about this, this is not a one-time exercise. This is something that requires ongoing research and data collection. And even when you get the next 5% connected, what's the needs of that next 5% change? And so being able to continually assess who's connected, who's not, and why, and how we can come together and create scalable products or scalable programs to address that are key. And then I would just add, this is not a solution, I know others have alluded to it, that can be solved by any one stakeholder. It really takes everyone. So you need the ISPs who have this expertise in providing internet service and are able to see across these different programs and see what's working and what's not. You need the districts who are nodes to students and can share information, but can also hear the needs about what the challenges are and where the pain points are, and build digital curriculum into the curriculum. You need community organizations who can be these trusted messengers and really grassroots on the ground. And then you need policymakers. And I think it comes back to the funding. I was talking to someone about EBB today, and they said, well, we'd love to print flyers, but there's no money for the support in the community orgs in EBB. And so I think having dedicated attention at the policy level of both funding buckets and then guidance can really help elevate the community and community engagement as part of the process.
Thank you, Hannah. I really love that you mentioned the funding piece. We represent over 500 affiliates who need money to do their work. So that is perfect. Lloyd, we've gone over a lot this afternoon. I want to end with something that you and I discussed before, equity. Why is equity important to this topic of internet adoption and getting people to say yes? And how do we build an equity lens into our work?
Well, I just gave a speech on this about 2 weeks ago as part of the University of Santa Clara Spring Speaker Series. And the title of my speech was, "It's not about the cat videos on YouTube anymore." And I alluded to this earlier in my earlier answer, when I mentioned if Brett and I were competing, it's about, what I call the 3 E's, although I'll admit the third one is a bit of a stretch. It's about the economy, it's about education, and equal access to government and quasi-government services. If you take, and there's actually a really good YouTube video that's about 4 minutes long from Project 1 Million that does a better job than I could possibly do at explaining this. So just Google that one. But really, it's really about, competition. Pew Center for Internet Life data shows that those who use computing devices to find jobs get jobs faster. They get promotions quicker. They keep their jobs longer. It also found that if you use a mobile phone exclusively, you suffer harms at almost the same rate as people who have no access at all. Then you need to kind of go into the user side of things. If your kid is trying to apply to college and has full access to the internet and a computer at home, and somebody else is dependent upon library hours or Starbucks hours, the likelihood is that the children who have the access at home on demand are going to perform better, have better access and better outcomes. So it's about, you can run this scenario many different ways. But it really is about the equity and then the concomitant harms that come without that access. The ability to succeed economically is harmed because you don't have internet access. The ability to succeed educationally or achieve the equal outcome is harmed because you don't have internet access. When you think about accessing governments, accessing hospitals, those of us during the pandemic who had full access to technology were much more able to easily and seamlessly access medical services, DMV services, the whole panoply of government and quasi-governmental services. And I can go on and on about those harms, but when you suffer those sorts of harms, then it impacts the rest of your life. Whether it's a rural area where if somebody has internet access, they can connect to their unemployment benefit office versus driving 200 miles to get there if you don't have internet access. A homebound senior without internet access might have to find a ride to the hospital or forgo medical care. When you have technology, you have that ability to connect wirelessly or seamlessly remotely to telemedicine. And I'm just going to end with a little bit of a personal note here. People see me where I am now, and I just want to let people know what you see today isn't where I grew up. I grew up in a zip code that didn't predict that I would be sitting where I am today talking about these things. And so, it is personal for me. It's not just an academic exercise. It's a personal exercise because, while I succeeded, I also recognize the element of luck that went into getting. Yes, it was hard work. Yes, all sorts of things, but there's also a huge element of luck. And I don't want to doom others to fail because they didn't have opportunities that I may have had. And part of that it means to me working to give people access to the tools necessary to succeed in the times we live in, and that is meaningful internet access.
Thank you, Lloyd. I think it's personal for a lot of us, so thank you for sharing that. Before we get to the Q&A, I'm going to give everyone 60 seconds to share some final thoughts. So if you have anything, final thought you want to share, this is your opportunity. I'll start with you, Brett.
Well, thanks again. A couple of really quick thoughts based on this, and it was great being with the panelists, and I wish we were together so we could all retire to the coffee bar or the regular bar and keep the conversation going. I think one, I heard something mentioned a couple of times, this issue of friction, and just appreciating and understanding that if you are someone who lives in poverty in this country, you experience all kinds of friction, and none of this is simple. Those of us who live in this, we tend to oversimplify what it takes to sign up, what it takes to get on board, and we just have to understand that more and deal with the friction. I think the second, and I go to what Lloyd said about the digital equity lens, and I think if we expand our view, widen the aperture on what our goal is. So yes, we want to have networks in front of everybody's homes. Yes, we want to get them all online, but there's a tendency to stop short and thinking about what is it to be equitable here. It's for people to live in the 21st century and to thrive. And for that, we've got to see it as we want them connected. We want them to be able to use this with skills. And that requires a whole different mindset in terms of how we approach this. And then I think the last thing that I would say is just who's involved. So, Heather made the point around, we got to make sure that the people who are impacted are at the table. So we're designing it to help them. But I also think broadly about who else should be in this and thinking about creative, innovative ways to connect people. Healthcare. We saw in the last year, all of a sudden, telemedicine. I worked on telemedicine 20 years ago. Now it's a thing because healthcare cared about it, right? Banking has to care about it. So there's a whole range of other elements that should be in there. That was a little more than a minute. I'm sorry, Gina.
It's okay. Lloyd, next, you get 60 seconds.
I think I've covered most of it, already. It's about what is the goal, as Brett just said, what are we driving towards? What is the purpose of getting the internet access into the homes? It's focusing on solving the right problems. As I think Hannah said earlier, it's not just about the broadband when the policymakers are passing these pieces of legislation. As Brett said, as I've said, it's a lot of work to connect the last people that are disconnected. Whether it's deploying in rural areas or it's connecting those who are reluctant for whatever reason. And if we just focus on the physical pipe, so to speak, the infrastructure, we're missing a huge component. The other thing is, it's people compare this to, say, the telephone of years ago. And Lifeline actually does subsidize a telephone, but you need to figure out the computing device component, because that's a lot more expensive than a telephone, and it lasts a lot. It's a lot more complicated, a lot more expensive, and it breaks more frequently, more quickly than your telephone does. If I had the telephone that I had when I was in college, I could still plug it into a phone jack and it would still work. If I had the computer that I had in college, you all would laugh hysterically and fall on the floor with it. It was the vast difference between telecommunications technology, at least at its rudimentary functional level, from then to now compared to computing technology. And so I think those are the kind of overall things that I think we need to make sure we focus on, take a holistic approach, focus on the totality of the problem. And then I'm just going to conclude with a pitch for, and anybody out there interested or have students who are interested in public policy, look up UC Riverside School of Public Policy. We have a huge undergraduate and graduate program in public policy, and I focus on these things. And we also have a number of other people there who focus on different aspects of technology. So great program focused on practical research as opposed to theoretical research. And I'll conclude with that.
Okay, Heather.
So I think my last point I'd like to make, I think, is about the equity lens. And I just want to just share just a quick anecdote about something a colleague said to me. And this is how I constantly try and frame it. We were doing a project with Columbus City Schools, and this was early on in the pandemic. And, the novel thing was kids used to get free lunch at school. And then when school buildings closed, neighborhood sites popped up, right? So everything was disaggregated so that families could go more quickly and get food. They didn't have to go to the school building. They could go wherever they were. And my colleague challenged me and he said, Heather, is that really equity? And I said, Chris, what do you mean? And he said, it would be equity. He said, think about it. I'm an older brother and I'm taking care of 3 kids. Every day I've got to get those 3 kids to that neighborhood site. Yeah, it's only a block and a half away or maybe 3 blocks away, but every day I have to go there. What if Uber Eats actually took those meals and brought them to my house so I don't have to get everybody all corralled up and over to that place? And this is something that I constantly think about, because I think, how do we make this easier to all of the points, right? When you're experiencing poverty and what that looks and feels like, how do we bring Uber Eats so that we can get people to a different place? So I'll leave you with that.
Okay, Hannah.
I think what really stands out to me is what a unique moment we're in. I think the pandemic has been challenging in so many ways and for so many people on really a micro and macro level. But the silver lining, or one of the silver linings of it, is just the attention that's been focused on the digital divide. And I think there was a lot of worry at the beginning that that focus would fade as the pandemic goes away. But I think that there is a realization now of just how foundational digital access and closing the digital divide, and permanently closing the digital divide, is to our society and our economy, both from the equity perspective and from the economic perspective of having those people included, and then also really driving the jobs and the businesses and the technology and the interactions of the next century. And I think the other thing that's really special is just, and we see it from the BCG side of things, just how many voices are at the table on this, really across the public, private, and social sectors. And I think it's very unique to have an issue that so many people are rallying around from so many perspectives, and you really need all of those voices in the room to get to a good outcome. And so while it is a challenge that this has persisted for so long, and it's not an easy one to solve, as we've discussed, I am optimistic about the amount of energy at the federal, state, and local levels against this.
Great, thank you all for adding those last 60 seconds of thoughts. We're going to hop to the Q&A. For any of you who hop off, this is being recorded.
You totally skipped me, Gina. You totally skipped me.
I did not need to do that,
Did I say something? Did I say something?
Oh my gosh.
Angela's probably texting you in the back, like, make Dan stop talking now.
No.
I'm totally joking.
Dan, I did not forget you. I wanted to make sure everyone knew Dan's going next.
Just a quick one. I love that Heather brought up equity, because that's so huge here. And the truth is, if we want to go by what the definition of equity really is, it would be giving poor people, most of whom are, BIPOC, better internet than everyone else for 50 years. That's when we start talking about equity. I want to give a quick shout out to Brett and Comcast. Listen, I give them crap all the time, but they listen to me. You listen to me, Brett, and the team. And I think one of my biggest struggles is I wish your competitors would come along with you. I had a conversation once with one of your competitors who said, "Now we have no interest in giving poor people internet." They actually said that to me. So I don't think that's true of Comcast. So our hope is that Comcast will keep doing it and drag along maybe some of their competitors kicking and screaming. Last two things. One, it's not just kids. Let's remember this. I think this is a big thing we're seeing, is it's all about schools and kids. There's a whole lot of people who are 35 years old that don't have internet, who don't have kids, a whole lot of 75-year-olds who need internet and don't have it. And the last thing I just want to say is, just because you have the internet doesn't mean you can afford it. I had a conversation with someone no more than a month ago who said, I have the internet, but the only way I have it, so I have it for my kids, is I take half the prescription medication I'm supposed to take, because that allows me to pay for the internet. So it's not just closing out those who don't have it, it's also dealing with people who have it but can't afford it. So thank you, Gina.
Thank you, Dan. So now we're really going to jump into the Q&A. And first up, I'm going to ask a question to Brett from Bobby. Let me get this question straight. He's saying Fresno housing residents average roughly 5 years at a single residence, but the property itself is obviously around much longer, and every family that moves in will be from the group Comcast has struggled to sign up for EIE. Is Internet Essentials going to be available as a bulk agreement to low-income housing providers?
That's a great question, Bobby. We learned a ton and we were fortunate just before the pandemic, a lot of partners, including partners on the West Coast, who were looking for these kind of bulk sponsored services agreements. And so the team had been working on it. And then when the pandemic hit, just accelerated. And we had really huge help from partners working through kind of gnarly challenges. So, Chicago and Philly and DC and other places. So I'm not sure, but I know some of my colleagues are on. So we'll take that back and we'll look at what that could look like. I know one of the things that we're going to see in this short term, particularly with EBB being launched and a conversation, EBB and the ECF being launched and a conversation about a permanent subsidy is, could that even be further simplified where you're providing the individual, the opportunity to choose the service that they want to buy. And we may talk a little bit about this in the questions, but I'll get back to you on the detail of your specific answer.
Thank you, Brett. Next up, Lloyd, I have a question for you. Do you have any specific policy solutions in mind to add to this conversation?
That's a great question, and one that I usually do address, because as a former policymaker and now researcher, my research is driven towards policy ends, informing policymakers as to actual practical steps that can be taken. And so I do have a couple, and Brett just touched on one of them. One of the things that I've been advocating for a while, but have yet to see anybody take me up on, is until the pandemic, is the notion of, instead of leaving the purchase and the monthly fee to the individuals and the problems that we see there, and it was Dan just mentioned the notion of splitting the medicine money so you can afford the internet, or hey, the car needs new tires so I don't have internet this month. Having a school district or a city go in and negotiate on behalf of those who aren't served with Comcast. And so that the individual doesn't pay the bill, the city does. I know what the low income rates are, but what I don't know is what would Comcast do if they knew that they had a guaranteed source of income from a school district for 9 months for X thousand people? Would the rate be lower? Could we negotiate a better rate than if we left it up to the individuals? Those sorts of things, if I were still in a policymaking position, I would call Brett into my office and begin having those conversations. At the other side of things, starting with the FCC, but also federally, people like to liken this internet provision to electricity. The difference is the ISPs are right now a competitive industry, not a regulated industry. And so I don't really actually want to wade into should the ISPs be regulated on this, because whether you regulate them or not, that doesn't answer the question of service provision for low income. I'd like to see the FCC really target more specific low-income provisions with some of the things we said today. Right now, I think I'd like to see, in areas where there's multiple providers, I'd like to see a collaborative approach where the government partners with the providers to ensure the provision of low-income people. Whether it's the way I mentioned earlier with a collective bargaining sort of situation or a different provision, but right now it doesn't work because there's no kind of real top-down leadership to say this is the population we want to address and we want to work with you to serve that population. And I think those sorts of things, especially as we've now gotten down to the hardest of the hard to serve, are really where we need to drive this conversation to get that permanent closing. And then the last thing, and it's something I said earlier, is any policies we look at need to look at a couple of other things. It needs to look at device and device refresh. What is the speed of that? If my child gets a device in kindergarten or first grade, and as an aside, that is one thing that the pandemic has showed us, is that you can provide children in a school district 30,000 devices and they aren't going to break them and they're not going to sell them on eBay. You can trust them with devices. How long will that device last through their school? Do they need 2 or 3 before they graduate from high school? And can we make sure that we have those devices for those who can't afford it? And obviously you put criteria around it, so we're not handing them out to everybody. So those are just a couple of the things, again, that you need to focus on. And then the last one I'm going to, talk about is, and I talked to a lot of schools and school districts last year, is you've got to think about your end users, and you've got to set up an administrative side that says we're about to give computers and internet service theoretically to a bunch of people who don't have high-tech skills. And even someone on this call or on this panel said that they asked for help. If my internet goes or my computer goes down, at night, I can use my phone as a hotspot. I know how to do that. And I actually just did that for my wife the other night because she had an urgent work project. But if your kid's in the middle of, an important project and your computer goes down or your internet goes down, what are you going to do? And so we need to focus not on, kind of devices that work for all of us that we love because they're so fancy, but devices that are purpose built, that are less likely to have somebody or people prevented from downloading malicious things that would then cause them problems later on, that are less likely to crash as you're trying to do an essential project, so that at 9 o'clock at night you don't have somebody out there stuck. Those are the policy things that we need, and the administrative side that we need to focus on. Sorry, that was long.
It's fine. Thank you, Lloyd. Dan, I have a question for you. It's from Joe. It's kind of two parts. So he points out that there's what's to be done outside of the K through 12 system that suffer the consequences of the digital divide, and how can we support the current generation of adults who lack basic skills for our economy due to our inequitable systems, education, employment, housing, infrastructure, institutions. Can you talk to Joe's thoughts and question?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the majority of people who run through our program are not in our family-based programming. They do it via one of our partnerships, and I think this answers that question. Is what we do is we very specifically and intentionally partner with community organizations that are trying to solve a problem, whatever that might be. So, for example, a lot of our partners are workforce development agencies. A lot of our partners are homeless shelters. A lot of our they are, we have a pilot going right now with one of the local hospitals that's trying to solve the telemedicine gap that exists right now. So what we do is we take Tech Goes Home, we embed it into those areas, which I don't think we need to prove relevance anymore, but it adds added relevance to it. And I think that is how you do this. I think Brett said this so well when he was talking about how Comcast approached IE, is that you work with the people who are on the ground. And then that way you get to the communities where there is trust that exists. And I wanted to, if I could quickly mention the issue of trust of learners, like, do they use the machine or sell it on eBay or something like that? I think, Lloyd, it's a good question. Something we found during the pandemic was incredibly happy. Maybe that's not the right word, but I was very pleased. Is that so? Pre-pandemic, Tech Goes Home, you get the machine at the end. You take your course in person, you get the machine at the end. Pandemic hits, everyone's virtual. So we switched our program, we put it upside down, so everything was virtual. Well, you can't take a virtual course without a computer and internet access. So we had to give everything to people in the beginning. So we UPS'd a machine, hotspot, internet, whatever, to people's houses a week, 2 weeks before the course even started. Those people could have left and just disappeared. Our graduation rate during the pandemic was 92%. It was actually 1% higher than it was pre-pandemic. So I think I'm glad, Lloyd, thank you so much for bringing it up. I think the people that we're serving are so desperate to learn and to get those resources for their families. And like back to the original question, it's not just about the kids, it's about the adults. I hope that answered it. I don't know if that did or not.
I hope so. I guess Joe, let us know if you didn't. Hannah, I have a question for you. It comes from someone anonymous, but it's around trust that you discussed, and you talked about the trust gap in the report. How do ISPs, the question is, how do ISPs and organizations work to build more trusting relationships, I guess? So I'm gonna leave that with you.
Yeah, I think there's a few things, and we discussed this, I would say, at length with Comcast as we were going through the research. So I think that there are things that the ISPs can do themselves, coming back to streamlining the application, streamlining and making the installation process really simple, making sure customer service can easily route to people. And one thing we did was looking at the Comcast materials, and you can do this for any ISP, but with the consumer lens and with the research lens of the barriers, and say, if I try and put myself in the shoes of this person, knowing they're low income, they have these fears, they have these uncertainties, would this, what we're trying to write, even if it's well-intended, create unintended consequences? And I think one thing we talked about is there are sometimes materials out there which says you can get a device for only $100, and someone might look at that and say, oh my gosh, the word only, like $100 is a lot for me. And so how do you really come from that consumer lens and look at your materials and your processes with that and try and solve for that? And then the other part I would say is the ISPs cannot do it on their own. And I think this comes back to everything else we were talking about in the conversation, but how can you really lean on and enable these community organizations? So you know what your installation processes are, you know what your application processes are. How can you create the videos? And I know Comcast has portals, and we've talked about this, and I'm sure other ISPs do as well. But how can you create those portals of resources of like, hey, if you're going to provide support or you're an educator and you're going to talk about it, we have some digital literacy resources, or we have a step-by-step guide. Let's make that really accessible to you so you can be our trusted messengers, because people believe your voice way more than they believe mine.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. On that, I want to thank all of our panelists, Hannah, Heather, Dan, Lloyd, and Brett, for your time today. This conversation has been amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to pass it over to Angela, who's going to close us out with some final thoughts.
That was fabulous. Thank you all so much. There's a bunch more questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to, but rest assured, some of those are not specific to this topic, because we have a lot more folks that want to learn what digital equity is, and they want to dive into all the details that folks like our panelists have been working on for decades for some of us. So I welcome everyone to the Net Inclusion webinar series, where we've been recording and posting those recordings. One of my staff will get that into the chat to make it easy to click on. So if you feel like there's questions you didn't get to, we welcome you to go check that out. We welcome you to our first and third Friday community calls, to the listserv, right? All the ways that we can help engage and have all more of these conversations with you. Big thank you to our panelists for doing this with us. The recording will be up tomorrow, and I hope everyone has a great Wednesday.